they're so wasteful. They just, and these are people that walk around and pick up the turds that their animals drop and use it to cook their bread at night. These people don't waste anything. I mean, if you're eating bread every day and it starts to taste kind of bland, you can understand why the turd gives it kind of a sharp flavor. It's kind of a delicacy. Dried turd is a good fuel source, and in the desert it's one of the few. And they use it sparingly, but they collect everything. There's nothing wasted. They live the way we lived 2,000 years ago. They're living the way Muhammad lived. I mean, you're talking about, as primitive an existence as I could ever imagine. So many people have said that about the Muslim faith. It's a religion of the desert. It's a religion where they didn't have a very complex lifestyle. And it fit in that frame.
Yeah, their religion is
so important to them.
So important that they would resist just to safeguard that.
Yeah. All the negative vibes I got as a filmmaker over there is because of the subject matter. The fact that I was filming things that these people didn't want the Russian world to really see. It was part of their culture, but they were very protective about it, and it wasn't something that was highly exposed. I have great footage in Peshawar, a famous Pashto town, of them doing that parade. They actually arrested me for filming that parade, but they go down the street and beat their chest, for Ali, for martyrdom, for what he did to keep their religion alive, keeping the Shia portion of the Muslim faith alive. And then they have these young men, or even older men, that have been chosen over the years to be real martyrs. And they'll jump out of this pattern. They're in kind of almost parade form, doing this beating on their chest, chanting. They'll jump out, and one of the crowd will hand them a bundle. And they'll undo the bundle, and it'll be this wooden stick with about 6 knives on chains, just the blades coming off it. And they suddenly start flailing their backs. And just lay their backs open, and if you look close, you can see the scars from the year before, the year before, the year before, and they're given special treatment because of who they are. I mean, they're saintly. They have a better chance of passing into paradise because of their sacrifices during their real life here on Earth. And then they'll pass out, and the Red Cross will patch them up, and they'll get back in the parade and pull their bandages off and start bleeding profusely and do it again. And it's a kind of dedication to a religion that I don't think you're going to get in a very complex society as ours is. We're dedicated to so many religions, be it cars, money, whatever. We've got so many diversions that I don't know if we're really dedicated to any one thing. In 1972, I had the misfortune of taking a contract with the American government to film the Russian-run opium fields just over the Ox River. The Ox River created a border between Afghanistan and Russia. They were doing a lot of opium production that was then smuggled through Afghanistan into Pakistan, where we've had a contingent of military people since '47 and a working relationship on a business level with a lot of Pakistani businessmen. So it was a great conduit for them to bring heroin into America. In the 60s and 70s, before crack cocaine was prevalent, heroin was responsible for about 1/3 of the financial crimes in America. So the Russians thought, what a great way to put pressure on capitalism as a successful economic way of life than by flooding the streets with heroin. So the DEA wanted to substantiate this, so I had been there long enough and had enough contacts that I got a tribal leader to introduce me to another tribal leader who had property on the Ox River, another Pathan, and I was able to go with him over the Salang Pass. We were traveling, my sound man, myself, in a 4-wheel drive truck with all our equipment, and we had an assassin with us. We came around a corner, they're standing with AK-47s, probably 12 soldiers. And it was just bad timing, remember, because the coup had just taken.
A military coup. Yeah, we thought it would be as open as it was before.
The first trip.
And it was completely different. It was not open at all.
Yeah, the Russians had come in.
They just assumed we were spies or something, and
our equipment. They arrested us and put in a political prison. And it was a prison that had typically just been a holding cell for the criminals of Kabul. And during the takeover, it turned into this political prison where they had all kinds of, it was really bizarre because they had all the rich people that were anti the communist takeover that didn't try to leave and got caught were in this prison. So I suddenly was, shoulders to shoulders with, the Prime Minister. And he's getting beat worse than me, so he's really depressed. It was martial law. They'd suspended all the civil courts, so I was court-martialed. It was a military state. And at the court-martialing, they said my equipment was my crime, my shotgun microphone, my telephoto lenses. I had no footage that was incriminating, but they said my equipment was my crime, and they sentenced my sound man and myself to a firing squad. We'd been in prison 9 months. I'd lost 80 pounds of body weight. I had every body parasite known to man.
They had us in leg irons and handcuffs and the bed bugs and the
scabies,
lack of
ringworm,
food or whatever, the unsanitary conditions and everything.
What did I look like when I made it home?
Oh, terrible, terrible. You were so thin. That was the time you were out on the patio, and he came home at night and he didn't bother us, so he slept in a chair on the patio, and when we got up he was just a rail, real thin. In fact, we took him to his doctor, who was a Jewish man, and he just nearly passed out when he saw you. He said it reminded him of the Holocaust. He was so upset. He said, oh my gosh, he was just skin and bones. He really looked awful.
We were fortunate enough that we'd been negotiating with the Afghan commandant of the prison, and we were able to pay him right after the court decision $50,000, and he smuggled us with soldiers out of the fort. But the positive thing about that experience was that I was then very cemented into the society. I was suddenly given credibility. I was the real deal. I would never have had the political contacts in that country that I have today. I wouldn't have been offered the opportunity to live with the Mujahideen group that I lived with during the war if it hadn't been for that exposure.
I've always felt very close to Chris, and I think maybe he did the things I might have done if I had been a boy, and I just always knew he'd be safe. I just felt like if he wasn't, I felt like I'd know it, which is, like my husband said, very naive, but I just felt like he can handle himself, because he always did.
This is how Soviet soldiers kill Mujahideen, at least according to the training manual. This is how the Red Army teaches its troops to swallow fear, as one officer put it, to overcome the obstacles they will face in Afghanistan. But Afghanistan is different. In that country, the enemy shoots back, and Soviet soldiers get killed. 12,000 at least since the Soviets invaded 8 years ago. In 1979, when the invasion began, Soviet troops were told they were doing their international duty, lending friendly assistance to a socialist revolution in progress. But as Valerie Burkhoff discovered, it wasn't quite that simple.
В Афганистане оказалось намного все сложнее.
Everything which I found in Afghanistan was more complicated. It was more complicated to participate in battles than it looked like in my imagination.
Сложнее взаимоотношения.
More complicated relationships with the people of Afghanistan.
I probably spent 3 years in a combat zone. 3 months here, come back to the States for 6 months, go back over for 3-4 months. I did that for 10 years during the war. The whole guerrilla movement over there was very splintered. It was 20 guys being financed by this landlord that has an interest in this property and he doesn't want to lose it. 20 guys over here being financed by this tribal leader that has this property. And so it was all these splinter groups. And I was lucky in a way. I befriended, strangely enough, a group of mercenaries or Mujahideen, guerrilla fighters, who were the hash smokers. So as it's turned out, the governor of Kandahar today, it's his family that supported me. It was his family that, they were hash farmers and their people, they had assassins and they were part of that, particular cult. So I'd travel with them and they'd always bring in all the stuff the Americans were giving them. And we were giving them bazookas, good rounds, good bazooka rounds. They used to have a little song they'd sing about the American bazooka round was so much better than the Russian or the Chinese. Because, if you're out in front of a tank and you've got a bazooka round going, and the only thing between you and getting away from being blown up is that round going off and doing its job, you do a little ditty about the good one. My biggest market for the footage that I was able to shoot was to the government. They had plenty of footage being shot in the northern provinces. Kabul, Peshawar connection was well covered by journalists from all over the world. Kandahar was not. I was one of the only that ever bothered to become comfortable there. So they needed to have footage of the Afghans in Kandahar using the weapons that we were given. Kandahar, unlike the war in the north part of the country, was a desert. Well, in a desert, there's no place to hide. You got to just bury yourself right in the middle of the city, right next to all the civilians. And you're just mingling, basically, with the civilians to survive. You got to be right on top of the Russians because they're nerve gassing everything outside the cities. They're trying to force everybody into a refugee status. So all the outlying areas, they called it, the locals called it Ja Baran, which means yellow rain. And they just have these helicopters, like, you know, crop dusters, fly over the villages and put this yellow mist in the air that made you violently ill and soon killed you. And these crazy people, I mean, when they'd go into battle, they didn't fight during the day, you know, and I think anybody who's been in a war zone is much, much safer as a guerrilla to fight at night, unless you're just totally suicidal. But they would fight in the daytime for me because I'd want to shoot footage. Because in the night, it was really just like a fireworks display. This really abstract fireworks display, because every now and then you'd get this really weird sound of a bullet coming close to your head. You know, it makes this really strange noise. They could actually tell, so sensitive, and hearing so many bullets all the time, they could tell which caliber it was. They'd tell me what was shooting at me.
So one of my jobs was to talk the guerrillas into fighting in the daytime. And we never went on a daytime fight that we didn't lose men unnecessarily, just because of the lack of cover.
We used to dig these tunnels and show them up with wood, you know, and have these kind of under the clay walkways of the cities. We'd have these tunnels so we could go from building to building, because exposure was so dangerous when they were, you know, on the prowl with those helicopters. I used to hear from the Afghan sympathizers that were working with the Russians that they'd flip a coin, because we'd always blow that first tank up. You know, and blowing a tank up with a bazooka is a terrible way for those guys to die. 3 guys in the tank, and if you look at my film footage, you realize that that rocket round hits that tank, and if you slow it down and look at it frame by frame, you get flashes. So what's happening is the rocket round's going off, the ammo inside the tank's going off, and the diesel fuel's going off. And it's going off just instantaneously. So these guys are fried or burned or lungs collapsed or whatever, you know, happens when there's a fireball all around you for a second or two. So they're dead. And once you disable that first tank, if you have placed yourself in an area where there are enough alleys and streets where the tank behind can't get around, you can maybe get the second tank before the helicopters come. But you know what really brought the Russians to their knees was the Americans are going, great opportunity for us now to addict the Russian soldiers to heroin. Here they're in a Muslim country, 200,000 plus, without any alcohol. You can't get a beer in Afghanistan. I don't care if you got a tank. I don't care what you got. You ain't getting a beer. It's just not there.
So here you've got a group of people, 250,000 Russian soldiers, rotated yearly for almost 12 years, who had no access to alcohol, but were in a depressed environment and wanted the release that they were used to getting from having a shot of vodka. So they went to the heroin and hash very quickly, and it became a thriving business.
So the Americans go, well, we'll give the Afghan guerrillas AK-47s, but we won't give them any bullets. And then we'll show them how to produce really good heroin. We'll set up the labs in Pakistan, in the tribal territory, in a safe zone, and bring it across with the new guns, but no bullets. And, you know, Russian soldiers given as many as 3,000 rounds to go into battle in Afghanistan with, and he's not expected to bring any of that ammo back. He just needs to bring his rifle back. So he goes out there and shoots a few hundred rounds off, hides somewhere, you know, and comes back and trades with an inductee from the Afghan minority tribes that's actually working with the puppet government and barracks with the Russians. So we got this perfect conduit to just trade them heroin for bullets. So the Russians are shot with their own bullets.
And this was the American government's philosophy, was that if we can do what the Russians were doing to us, the reason I got put in jail was filming the Russians growing opium. If we can do the same to them, we can then bring their government down.
In fact, I think the most prominent footage I ever shot was those 10 acres of opium fields in downtown Kandahar during the war that the guerrillas were openly